actually it was sold to the public as an act of release, right? An act of freedom, buccaneering Britain, right? That once we were freed from our membership of the European Union single market, this regulatory behemoth that was dictating the way in which the UK ran its businesses. One sort of Eurosceptic, which is an anti-Europe politician on the right in the UK, said we described it as like being shackled to a corpse. And so it was sold to the public as unshackling ourselves from that corpse. Of course, the reality was that membership of the European Union single market, which has a common rule book for goods, a common referee, if you like, in the European Court of Justice, was actually a facilitator of trade. It meant that you could put a box of sausages in a van in Birmingham and drive it to Bonn or Barcelona or Bratislava without let or hindrance. It was a single market, only a deeper single market in lots of ways, perhaps even than some US states where you have different rules and different labor rules, etc. There's a large degree of harmonization, but the political narrative never internalized that. And so, one of the kind of slight madnesses of Brexit, which I'm sure your US listeners will appreciate, is that the same government that was promising Brexit was going to deliver buccaneering Britain, a boost for free trade, etc., by us being able to do trade deals around the world with India and Australia, etc., was the same government that was doing a reverse trade deal, which you identified, with its biggest market. Nigh on 50% of UK trade is with Europe, with the European Union. So this, the contradiction there was just mad.
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Peter Foster, who's the public policy editor of the Financial Times and author of the recently released book, What Went Wrong With Brexit, and What Can We Do About It? So, Peter, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me on, Anthony.
No problem. So I guess my first question is, what was your influence for writing the book?
It's a good question, that, because people, I've been writing about Brexit right from the beginning, from the referendum in 2016 all the way to now, through the negotiations, and then, of course, into the impacts of Brexit as we left the single market. And so, people would say to me, gosh, you're the original Brexit bull. You've been going on about this for so long. Why haven't you written a book about it? And the answer was actually always because nobody really wanted to publish one, because it just felt like Brexit was in a dead end. It was an inert subject. Neither political party really wanted to talk about it. And, the publisher of this book, Canongate Books, came to me ultimately and asked me to write the book. And I think they did that because they felt that there was an inflection point coming up on Brexit. The polls suggest we're likely to get a new Labour government when the election happens next year. There's the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the implementation review from 2026. And the opinion polls also seem to be moving, don't they, in terms of people's attitudes to Brexit. And so you put all those three things together, and suddenly it feels like there is a space for a kind of new conversation on Brexit.
Yeah, I guess if we look at the past 5, 6, 7 years, it has been a very tricky conversation to have, because I guess there's the hard remainers, the hard leavers, and it's it can be quite challenging to actually get that, I guess, constructive conversation.
No, indeed. And, I don't want to be too naive about it, because actually, if you look in the last week or so, when Labour has started to open the conversation, Keir Starmer gave an interview to the Financial Times, my newspaper, saying he wanted a better deal with Europe and he wanted to get closer to Europe. And it immediately has caused something of a kind of firestorm, with the Daily Mail running front page headlines saying Keir Starmer prepares to betray Brexit. What exactly he's betraying is a good question, because, even Tory voters in 2019, this Redfield and Wilton polling that came out just recently over the summer, which showed that even those who voted for Brexit in 2019, remember the Get Brexit Done election, they believe, significant plurality of voters believe that Brexit has made the cost of living crisis worse. It's made the economy weaker. It's made our trade performance weaker. It's made the country poorer than it otherwise would have been. So, it's still interesting to me that the right-wing bubble press, the Mail and the Telegraph, are still peddling this betrayal narrative about Brexit, any attempt to shift the dial from the very sovereignty first, ultra hard Brexit that was negotiated by Boris Johnson and his negotiator David Frost, basically to satisfy the right wing of the Tory party that put Johnson into Downing Street, that any kind of movement from that is an act of betrayal rather than an act of common sense that is going to hopefully make it more encouraging investment climate, settle down the regulatory divergence climate, actually bring investment back to those red wall seats that voted for Brexit in the Midlands and the North, but who are actually more reliant on Brexit impacted industries for their higher paying, higher GVA jobs. I said at the top that new space for conversation is opening up, but there are definitely forces who are trying to shut that space down. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that we absolutely need to fight that. We need to have a conversation where merely discussing how we handle post-Brexit trade is not betrayal of Brexit. The main parties are clear, we're not going back in anytime soon at least, but let's have a decent conversation about what we actually need to do to protect the car industry, to protect the chemical industry and our manufacturing. 50% of this country's exports are manufactured goods. People forget that. Manufacturing drives services, it drives R&D. The Labour Party wants to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. And yet it still doesn't really want to address the issues thrown up by leaving the EU single market. So there is lots to talk about. Space is emerging and we need to fight to stop that space being shut down, in my view.
Yeah, it's a great point. So maybe if we take a step back, and a lot of our viewers are from the US and might not have the context. So can you maybe go over, I guess, some of the promises that were laid out during Brexit, maybe why it sort of got the majority in the end, and how the actual implementation of it has occurred? Because I guess Brexit has sort of been this thing globally of this, I guess it's been the first real movement of deglobalization and trying to build up barriers against trade for people to protect themselves, I guess. So yeah, maybe you can go more into that.
But Anthony, that's a really interesting read. That Brexit was a deep globalization act of protectionism. But what's interesting is that actually it was sold to the public as an act of release, right? An act of freedom, buccaneering Britain, right? That once we were freed from our membership of the European Union single market, this regulatory behemoth that was dictating the way in which the UK ran its businesses. One sort of Eurosceptic, which is an anti-Europe politician on the right in the UK, said we described it as like being shackled to a corpse. And so it was sold to the public as unshackling ourselves from that corpse. Of course, the reality was that membership of the European Union single market, which has a common rule book for goods, a common referee, if you like, in the European Court of Justice, was actually a facilitator of trade. It meant that you could put a box of sausages in a van in Birmingham and drive it to Bonn or Barcelona or Bratislava without let or hindrance. It was a single market, and a deeper single market in lots of ways, perhaps even than some US states where you have different rules and different labor rules, etc. There's a large degree of harmonization, but the political narrative never internalized that. And so, one of the kind of slight madnesses of Brexit, which I'm sure your US listeners will appreciate, is that the same government that was promising Brexit was going to deliver buccaneering Britain, a boost for free trade, etc., by us being able to do trade deals around the world with India and Australia, etc., was the same government that was doing a reverse trade deal, which you identified, with its biggest market. Nigh on 50% of UK trade is with Europe, with the European Union. So the contradiction there was just mad. And yet politically it never landed. It was all about freedom, and there's loads of history and legacy in that. It's what, this idea that sort of, and it all stems, I think, from kind of post-war history that, the UK stood outside the Europe that was, not conquered by the Nazis and sort of, had its empire, and all of that sort of exceptionalist narrative that still is somehow residual in the UK lent to this completely, fallacious idea that leaving our largest market on our doorstep was somehow going to free us to become a trading superpower. I mean, of course, at the same time, the rules of global trade that we saw, expanding global trade in the 1990s were being ripped up. So America is, decoupling from China, becoming increasingly protectionist in its own right, as indeed is the European Union via its regulatory heft. The Green New Deal is lots of, which is the European answer to the Inflation Reduction Act in lots of ways, is in lots of ways a quite protectionist piece of regulation. And of course, Brexit leaves the UK piggy in the middle, if that's a phrase that makes sense to American listeners. England, little old Great Britain, stuck, squeezed between these two regulatory superpowers in the United States and the European Union, really struggling to find its footing in the world, in a world where actually business and investors want regulatory certainty and want to know that, on a 10, 15-year horizon, that there is a stable environment for them to invest. And we saw with the Liz Truss 49-day premiership that the UK of late has been anything but stable. It's been something of an international laughingstock, less so under Sunak, the latest prime minister, but, a lot of damage has been done. And so that promise of, buccaneering Britain, has actually not materialized. And the public are slowly realizing that. They're slowly coming to terms with that.
I guess some people would say maybe COVID has had a large impact on a lot of the implementation, and it's hard to actually diverge between what's been impacted by Brexit, say inflation and wage increases and other factors versus COVID, because it's been sort of a global phenomenon. So is it possible to see, whether it's just had this hiccup in the short term, but could maybe be more successful in the long term? Or, can you see that?
So disaggregating, the impacts of COVID, of inflation, of the war in Ukraine, the energy supply shock, all of those things are difficult to do, although there is some economic modelling. John Springford at the Centre for European Reform, Jun Du at Aston University, who use these doppelganger models, because all economies are impacted by the war in Ukraine, by inflation, by the COVID-19 pandemic. You can therefore start to screen out the unique factor for the UK, which is Brexit. And if you look at investment and trade intensity, imports and exports, most economists would say there's a pretty clear, discernible Brexit effect there. I think, the argument that, well, it'll get better over time, or, once we've got through the hiccup, falls down on the fact that Brexit creates a structural piece of uncertainty for the UK. So before, we used to take our regulations on whether it was GDPR, data transfers, AI, whatever it might be, we would take the regulation essentially from Brussels. We'd have inputs to it as a member of the European Union, but we would take it from Brussels and we would implement it into domestic UK legislation via the British Parliament. Now, lots of times, that created a narrative of us rule taking from Brussels, etc. But what it did mean is that there was a dependable pipeline of regulation coming down the tracks. And that pipeline of regulation, once you'd complied with it, whether it was on cars or chemicals, whatever it might have been, gave you access to a market of 500 million people. So when you look forward and you make the argument, oh, well, surely now we're outside the EU, we can have nimbler regulations, we can have deregulation. The problem you come up with is that big companies with transnational supply chains and transnational investment don't want that. So what we've seen actually is that the government's offered companies a chance to say where they want to get rid of EU red tape, where they want to diverge, and actually they don't want to diverge. And it's not, logically clear why there may be some upside costs of diverging, some upside benefits of diverging to individual companies, but you always have to offset that against the downside costs of creating a small and separate regulatory environment that deters investment, that deters trade, that creates barriers to trade. And there are more barriers coming down the tracks, right? To your point about won't it get better in the future? Well, when you look at, for example, EU carbon taxes, carbon border adjustment mechanisms coming in, supply chain due diligence, pay transparency directives, plastic packaging directives, all of that now creates friction. It was bureaucracy that the UK economy would have suffered if it was a member of the European Union. Now it's not only bureaucracy, but it's just friction between UK business and its European trading partners, which are still, as I say, 48% of exports, of imports, 42% of exports in the last year are with Europe. And so it's not at all clear, and nobody has made, by the way, the kind of cogent case as to why Brexit gets better in the future. It's not at all clear to me why that's the case. And what's interesting is actually the pro-Brexit camp has completely failed to make the public logical business case for Brexit. Whenever they're challenged on this point, they just go back to, well, it was a vote and it's sovereignty, and they just wave flags at you. And so that I think is the public, even if they don't understand the kind of exact detail of that, they are kind of realizing that we've backed ourselves into something of a corner, globally speaking, and that's where I think going back to the start of our conversation, where potentially space for a different conversation opens up.
Yeah, and I know probably if we look at maybe where Brexit was very highly voted in some of those regions you mentioned before, the high, those manufacturing regions, the regions that have traveled, maybe been troubled by globalization and the demanufacturing of the UK. And maybe a big point that they were talking about was immigration and the unfettered immigration that was allowed through this scheme, and maybe the addition of some of the Eastern European countries in 2004. So is that something that maybe has had a positive impact in the fact that there's not this unlimited pool of labor? Now there's, if we look at maybe the negotiation, possibilities, they do have better negotiations against businesses. Obviously, it's probably not good for the business and the economy, but it might be better for those individual people.
So there are some examples of that. So what's interesting is, you're right. One of the big issues in the referendum, particularly for those who voted to leave the EU, was free movement, right? The right of European Union citizens to come and live and work in the UK without let or hindrance. And frankly, the government had no idea, because you didn't get stamps in your passport, you didn't need a visa. They had no idea how many people from Poland and Romania and Hungary, etc., were in the UK. And it became a really divisive issue, partly because the British government, when it started, the Tony Blair government in the mid-2000s, didn't take these transition controls, which other big EU countries like France and Germany did, to try and feed that into the system. The thing is, for business, that created, as you say, a very flexible pool of labor. What we've seen since Brexit, interestingly, is that the UK has introduced a points-based system, but actually the numbers of net migrants and economic migrants into the UK, legal migrants, is higher than it was before the referendum. They're not coming so much from Europe now, they're coming from other countries, but the amount of net migration hasn't fallen. All it's done is make access to migrant skills more expensive and less flexible for business. The level of skills has gone up slightly. There have been some localized positive effects. For example, truck driver wages are up by 12 to 16% in the UK. So tick, that's a thing for truck drivers. But of course, you have to remember that one man's or one woman's pay rise is another man's pay cut. And actually what's happened in the truck driving industry is that it's less flexible, logistics has become more expensive, and actually a lot of those extra truck drivers that have come into the profession after the pandemic are people who held truck driving licenses, but they were mechanics. They had licenses for driving the trucks around the yards when they were repairing them and keeping them ready to go on the road, right? So a lot of those mechanics saw that there were higher wages to be made going back on the road. So they went on the road. So now there's a shortage of mechanics in the haulage industry. So, I think you have to be really careful because what happens is you get localized benefits. So a Brexiteer is going to say, well, look, truck driving wages went up. But actually, overall, the UK economy is less flexible and therefore ultimately probably less productive. And the government is, quietly giving way. So we have this thing called the shortages occupation list, which lowers the points-based bar by which you can bring people into the country. And they keep increasing the list of occupations that are on the list, which is a recognition that actually the UK economy needs migrant labour to keep it going. It's interesting, if you look at the polls, migration has become a much less important, much less salient issue in UK political discussion than it was before the referendum. And the current Labour Party, the opposition Labour Party, who are expected to form a government after the next election, if the polls are correct, one of the reasons why they're so defensive about Brexit, so they're really not saying they're going to do much different than what the ruling Conservative Party is doing, is precisely because they don't want to touch this nerve again about free movement. And even things like a youth mobility scheme, which is being one of the things that's being discussed to improve, yet allow young Italians to come and work for a couple of years in a bar in London to get their English up, and young Brits go and work in a ski resort in the Alps, etc. Even those schemes, I suspect, will fall foul of political pressure in the populist right, saying this is free movement by the back door. That's going to be a challenge for the Labour Party if they get into power and they want to do one of these youth mobility schemes. I mean, the thing, of course, is that, labour markets are tight all over Europe, even in countries like Hungary and Poland and Romania that were previously sources of, relatively unskilled labour into the UK, truck drivers and fruit pickers, etc. And so it's actually not at all clear that even if you started free movement again, you'd get anything like the deluge of free movers that came, as you said, after the 2004 enlargement, where those countries in the old Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Romania later, but shifted, came to the UK to take up work opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess you could say recently there have been the sort of short-term impacts of students returning after COVID, student visas, Ukraine refugees, Hong Kong, sort of British nationals who have come back. So maybe we might have to wait a bit longer to see whether that changes, and that's just increased the short-term migration. But
actually, the truth is, even if you aim off. So there was the Hong Kong scheme. So the British government offered visas to people caught up in the Hong Kong security law. Obviously, there was the Ukraine scheme. But even if you screen out Hong Kong and Ukraine, net migration to the UK, points-based migration, still higher than it was immediately before the referendum.
Okay. And then did Europeans have to do the point migrations beforehand?
Yeah.
So they were included in that as well?
So the idea of the system, and this is the kind of, again, one of the kind of fallacies of Brexit. The idea of the system is that you treat an Australian exactly the same way that you treat an Austrian, right? Even though one is, on the doorstep and the other one's 12,000 miles away. The points-based system is blind. There's no privilege now for Europeans to come to the UK. So what you've seen is, for example, the number of European students that come to UK universities has fallen by half, because they no longer pay home fees, local fees. They have to pay much higher foreign fees. So, the effect of that approach to migration and Brexit has essentially been to, treat our neighbourhood countries, the European Union countries, in exactly the same way that, we treat Australia, Japan, or anyone else. And, there is a kind of logical theory to that, but that ignores the fact that, the neighbourhood is important. The truth is, gravity matters. The old adage of you double the distance and halve the trade, it matters. You are going to do more collaboration with scientists in Europe than you are scientists on the other side of the world, because you have a shared legal environment, you have shared investors, you have shared supply chains, you have shared, history and culture. And so this idea that, it just ignores the reality that, you know, what happens down your street is important as opposed to what happens, you know, in a city 20 states away, right? I mean, you know, it should be obvious that, but it's all part of this sort of, you know, super sovereignty first approach to Brexit, which, as I said, the polls are suggesting a lot of people realize is not working.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, you know, half of the book is sort of about the problems and the challenges that we're experiencing. I know the other half is about, I guess, maybe ways to fix it. So I'm not sure if we can go over a few of those methods of maybe fixing the challenges and the issues with the current Brexit that we have.
So the tricky thing is, when you're asked to write a book, what went wrong with Brexit and what to do with it, what to do about it, right? You can't really ask people to pay for the book if the second half of the book just goes, not much really, right? But there is a certain amount of truth that actually, maybe that's what I should have written. If, as the Labour Party is saying, that, we're not going to rejoin the EU single market or join a customs union with the European Union. If that's the position of the Labour Party and the Labour Party wins the next election, the truth is there are limited things you can do. Now, I think there are some things you can do. One of them is to draw a line under the kind of very oppositional political relationship between London and Brussels. We saw Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, David Frost, taking a deliberately adversarial relationship. I don't think Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour Party leader, will do that. He was in Paris this week, seeing Emmanuel Macron. He will want to draw a line under that relationship. He'll want to maybe think about contributing to the security environment of Europe, to the rebuilding of Ukraine, the arming of Ukraine, etc. There are ways in which the UK could deepen its security posture and dialogue with the European Union. And that might be an excuse also to build some sort of diplomatic structures, because right now, when we remember, every single quarter, the Prime Minister of Britain would join with the 27 other European Prime Ministers and Chancellors and Presidents and have a big powwow at the European Council. That was just a piece of diplomatic architecture. So I think, you could hopefully try and create a piece of diplomatic architecture just to get relations moving again, to get the Brits back in the room. Because whilst we've been off squabbling with ourselves, lots of other bits of architecture have come into play. So there's a Trade and Technology Council between the US and the European Union, which the Brits are excluded from, which is important when dealing with big tech and AI and all this stuff coming down the tracks. So there's a diplomatic piece. I think there is then some things you could do around the edges on trade. So, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about youth mobility. So you could do a youth mobility scheme. You could do a scheme in order to reduce the amount of checks on plant and animal products. Because what Brexit does is apply rest of world trade checks to a super high intensity trade border. We have a Canada-style trade deal, but, Canada's 6,000 miles away, and it does 1/10 of the trade with the EU that the UK does. We're linked to Europe by a pipe under the channel. It's a super high frequency, high intensity trade border. Our manufacturers are intermediate in nature. So you could do what they call a veterinary deal to reduce those checks on plant and animal products. You could do some alignment of regulation where you agree to follow EU rules, but really crucially, you always have to remember with the EU that alignment doesn't bring you access. So even if you follow the exact same regulations, say, on organic certification for organic food products, if you don't submit yourself to the EU regulatory apparatus and enforcement apparatus, you still have to show up at the border with a piece of paper attesting to the fact that you comply with that directive. And that's where the cost is. It's not about the man in the peak cap or the tariff, right? Yes, we could align. That would make it easier because then you've only got one set of rules, but you still have the paperwork required to prove that you've followed the rules. But that is about the limit of what you can do if you're going to stick to this red line of no single market and no customs union. And the problem with that is, with linking our carbon market is another last big thing we could do. the carbon pricing system, the emissions trading scheme. If we don't do that, there's another barrier, right? But most of these things will not do that much to shrink the persistent marginal competitive disadvantage that comes from being outside the European Union single market. So crudely, it will still be much easier to buy something from Pedro in Barcelona than from Peter in Brighton. And for as long as that's the case, that will make the UK less attractive to invest in. If you're an American company and you want to use the UK as a gateway to Europe, which is what a lot of American companies and Japanese companies did, you're more likely now to go to Ireland because you can just go straight in, no paperwork. It makes it less attractive to invest in the UK, but it also makes it less attractive for European companies to trade with the UK. If you're going to have your supplier in Brighton or in Barcelona, it's just easier at the margin to have it in Barcelona. And nothing that the Labour Party is talking about is going to make that much difference to that basic fundamental problem. And so that's the kind of limit to what you can do to fix Brexit. I do think, however, it's worth exploring and examining and doing those things, if nothing else, in order to create a kind of political conversation in the UK that is honest about where the UK really is vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And then if we're not going to do that stuff, think really hard about what the UK investment offer is to the rest of the world, how you make a stable regulatory environment, how you provide the land, the labour, that is going to make the UK an attractive investment destination, particularly in the high-end, gene editing, life sciences, the stuff we're really good at in the Oxford, Cambridge arc, in that golden triangle between Oxford, Cambridge, and London. But I fear, as things stand, we're still in the denial stage. But I think it'll move. We are going to go into this space with a new conversation.
Yeah, so hopefully move in a positive direction. So, Peter, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. My last question is, what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation and from the book?
I think my biggest message is that we need honesty. I've written the book because people have this sort of vague sense of, well, Brexit isn't working, right? And what I try and do, it's not a long book. It's a short book, deliberately. Nobody wants to read 150,000 words on Brexit. It's a short, there's no footnotes, there's no indexes. It's a short, punchy piece of analysis that explains structurally why Brexit doesn't work, what we can do about it, and says, let's have an honest conversation about where we are and come up with some practical solutions that are going to get the UK out of the hole that it's dug itself into.
Perfect, great message. So thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate it. So if anyone wanted to buy the book or maybe find out more about your other work, where would the best places for that be?
So the book is called What Went Wrong With Brexit and What We Can Do About It. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it in Waterstones. Just jump online and it's easy enough to get. And if you want to read the stuff that I do day in, day out, then you'll find me, Peter.Foster, on the FT website, the Financial Times website, the pink paper.
Yeah, perfect. I'll put that in the description below, but thanks again for your time.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.